Hey, welcome, World Politics students. Today we're going to talk about kind of a different subject than those that we've been studying up to now. We're going to talk about international organizations. And I say it's different because up to now we've been talking about conflict and foreign policy and things that lead to tension between states. As we turn to the rest of the semester, we're going to look at international organizations and the international economy and phenomena that some scholars argue help to bind states together, or they're a little bit more integrative in world affairs. There's really been an explosion in the number of international organizations in the world over the past 50 years, and especially in the past 25 years or so since the end of the Cold War. And what we're going to talk about today is what that means for world affairs. And as you might guess, people who are more realist in their orientation and their worldview argue that at the end of the day, this doesn't add up to much. States are the repositories of economic and military might. States are the repositories of political sovereignty. And so international organizations, when push comes to shove, are merely reflections of state interests. They really can't be much more. On the other hand, people who have more liberal perspectives or constructivist perspectives argue that there's so many more of these entities now, and they're handling so many more issues that perhaps it is changing some dynamics in world affairs. Perhaps it is changing and kind of constraining the anarchic system that states interact in. Some people argue that this may be one of the most important trends in the world today, this dramatic rise in international organizations. So we're going to spend 2 days on international organizations. First, we're going to talk about non-governmental organizations, and then we're going to talk about intergovernmental organizations. But what are these two entities? What are the definitions of the two? IGOs are basically entities that build bridges, they're formal institutions between governments. There are all sorts of examples of IGOs. The United Nations is a prominent example. But IGOs deal with small issues that can have an impact and have made a substantial contribution to world affairs and to human progress. For example, it was an IGO that eradicated smallpox, one of the most dangerous and prevalent diseases known to mankind, the World Health Organization. It's an IGO that allows air travel between countries, allows jets to land in different countries and to overcome language barriers. It's another IGO, the Universal Postal Union, that allows thousands upon thousands, actually at one point, 8 billion pieces of mail to travel between countries, to flow across national boundaries. Now that's declined with the rise of digital communication and the internet. NGOs, so IGOs are bridges between governments. There are these formal institutions that are created between governments. NGOs can be called bridges between people. So it's all sorts of associations of private individuals that try to affect policies across borders on a wide range of phenomena. There is some blur in terms of the definition of these two phenomena. For example, something called the International Telecommunications Satellite Organization, incredibly important today, helps to coordinate satellite communication across the globe, which influences so much of what we do. It has both private corporations sitting on the board as well as governments. Another example is Interpol, which I'm sure you know about, the International Criminal Police Organization. So by some definitions, it's really not an IGO because it doesn't have the head of state. doesn't represent the full government in this international body. It doesn't have that authority. It represents police organizations or police entities within different states, but it doesn't speak for the state overall. So some claim it is an NGO. Because of the blurriness of these definitions, a lot of scholars just fall back and argue that if it was created by treaty, a treaty between states, then it's an IGO. And if not, it's an NGO. Again, there's been just dramatic growth in both of these types of organizations over the past quarter century and a half century. Mentioning NGOs, and that's going to be the focus of our discussion today. If you think about NGOs in a broad, informal way, they're really an ancient phenomenon. I mean, think about the wanderings of explorers. Think about missionaries representing a non-governmental entity, some kind of religious organization, and working across borders to try to convert individuals to that religion. Spice merchants, pirates, these are all NGOs. Pirates have a big influence on world affairs today. Numerous countries, the European Union, the US, China, Russia, they patrol the coast of Somalia to try to ensure international shipping continues, flows freely through the coast of Somalia, because piracy is such a large issue in that area. And that's a crucial choke point for international trade. With the rise of industrialization, which made communication and transportation so much easier, these NGOs really started to take off in numbers. And the reason is some of these groups felt that borders were irrelevant and artificial for what they were trying to accomplish. Examples are union leaders. So think about union movements that interacted and coordinated across borders. Scientists who think, doesn't matter what nationality I am, I want to share my information and I want science to progress so humanity can progress. So with the rise of industrialization through the 19th and 20th centuries, these cross-border ties became more and more institutionalized. And they started to grow fairly dramatically. Some of these early NGOs, of course, had substantial influence on world affairs. Think about the Communist International, interacting across borders and spawning revolutionary movements. Abolitionists, pressuring for the end of slavery across Europe to the United States, to Canada, to other countries. Think of the suffragettes. Again, a non-government organization pushing for women's right to vote across multiple countries, coordinating and organizing. In terms of the location of these NGOs, as you might guess, most are headquartered and most participants are located in the first tier, because these are the countries that have more open societies generally that allow for this type of association and this type of coordination, and also these are wealthier societies, so more people have free time and the ability to become involved in these non-governmental movements. Their evolution over time has also been uneven. Their growth over time has been inconsistent. They tend to grow most dramatically after major war, because this is a time in the wake of devastating conflicts that governments and peoples want to build a better, more harmonious world. And so these bridges between peoples develop, hoping to change phenomena, to change society. And they've grown dramatically since the end of the Cold War era, because of the rise of globalization and communication. This graph shows the number of NGOs that have formal consultative status with the UN, and you can see their growth, especially taking off at the end of the 1990s, but their growth from almost non-existent in earlier periods. We really don't know the total numbers of NGOs, international NGOs on the world today, because it depends on their definition. Your book authors say there are tens of thousands, and that is probably correct. The most notable ones are those that are affiliated with the UN, and their numbers are close to 4,500 or more. So these NGOs, they encompass all sorts of human activities. Some are really trivial and some are very important because they're just, again, they're just ties between societies, ties between individual citizens across borders. I don't think, most likely, an NGO like the International Confederation of Accordionists, who play the accordion, or the World Federation of Master Tailors, they're not going to have a huge impact on the trajectory of world affairs. But there are some NGOs that have a really big impact. So think about the Roman Catholic Church. It has a huge influence on policy in different countries around the world. Think about large multinational corporations. Those are a form of NGO. Say Shell Oil or other energy companies, major influence on energy policy in different countries around the world. Transnational rebels operating across borders help to topple governments in different parts of the world. Terrorist organization, again, it's a non-governmental entity and they tend to coordinate across borders. So something like Al-Qaeda, the Islamic ISIL, which became a state for a short period of time, the Islamic State, these are non-governmental organizations that have huge impact on world affairs. So a lot of the things we've been talking about this semester thus far have been fairly heavy. We've talked about nuclear proliferation, we talked about conflict and cycles of conflict. We talked about the rise of multipolarity and tensions on the world stage. So for today, as we talk about NGOs, the tangent I want to take is a little bit more lighthearted. I want to step back and give you an example of what was one of my favorite political parties. And it's an NGO, it's an international NGO because it had coordination with some other English-speaking countries, particularly Australia. And this is just to take a break. It's to take a mental break because we've been talking about some heavy stuff this semester. This party that underscores the lighthearted nature of politics is the Monster Raving Loony Party. So this was a party in Britain. Actually, it still is a party in Britain. It still runs candidates. And believe it or not, a spinoff from the Monster Raving Loony Party won a seat in the British Parliament, the Green Monster Party. But it was founded by a former glam rock singer. So glam rock would have been the 70s with David Bowie or Gary Glitter, a man named Screaming Lord Sutch. But he founded this political party, and anyone can run for office in Britain as long as they put down a monetary deposit, and then they're an eligible candidate and they're put on the ballot. So he initiated this party called the Monster Raving Loony Party, and he was just would come out with these outrageous outfits, and you would see him, there he is with one of his supporters, and you would see him, he would run against the sitting prime minister in that district. And so when election results were shown, and if the sitting prime minister won or lost, it's going to be covered. You'd see him in the background looking crazy, uh, um, smiling, uh, uh, and it just added a different touch to politics. Some of his campaign literature, just again, politics can be so heavy. It was just off the wall. He argued that Britain could overcome the national deficit by placing a tax on fuzzy dice. He said they need to ban greyhound racing because they wanted to prevent the country from going to the dogs. He said he'd abolish the Foreign Office because Britain's primary foreign ambassadors should be Manchester United, Arsenal, and Liverpool, their soccer teams. And his slogan, which was just fantastic, was vote for insanity because you know it makes sense. Again, monster raving loony party, screaming Lord Such. He died, unfortunately, a while ago, but the party continues. And kind of interestingly, initially, his party was continued. The leader of the Monster Raving Loony Party after his passing was his cat. But the party still exists, adds a little lightheartedness to something that can be really serious and really weighty, and that's politics. There are other Britain, because of these lax laws, allowing most anyone to form a party and to register. There are all sorts of parties like this in Britain. There's the Fancy Dress Ball Party. There's the Onward to Mars Party, founded by a Cambridge physicist who says the primary purpose of future government should be to send a British space vessel to Mars. So this man and this party for a while was an international NGO. Some aren't that influential, obviously. So how are NGOs influential? And here's where we have some arguments, and we're not sure. There are just so many of these entities. Their activities are so broad and so hard to track that there are arguments about how they influence world affairs in a more general sense. And there are three ways the rise of NGOs, their dramatic increase over time, are said to influence world politics. The first is the most indirect and subtle, but it potentially is the deepest. And this is that exposure to other peoples and cultures that comes with NGO involvement. So it is argued, tends to create a more cosmopolitan and a less nationalist outlook among the people participating in them. So as you are engaged in the World Confederation of accordionists, you interact with accordionists from around the world and you get to understand them and their cultures. And if you rise to be an elite within your society or a policymaker, perhaps that promotes friendlier policies or at least a less nationalistic outlook. Critics of this claim argue that if individuals are too cosmopolitan, they're really not going to rise too far in the national political system because they won't be seen as being supportive enough of national causes. They'll be seen as going native, supporting other cultures and other societies, and not being so, for example, not putting America first, or whatever country it is, Nigeria first. The second way NGOs influence world affairs is through information and consultation, especially with IGOs like the UN. So these associations who specialize on certain topics can become very powerful in terms of gathering information that is important for world affairs. Good example, Amnesty International. Amnesty International monitors, it's a non-government organization, operates across borders, gets donations from across the world. It operates around the world to monitor human rights violations. And it is turned to by organs within the UN for information, for accurate information. Some people have called it almost an arm of the UN because they are the repositories of really accurate information about violations. Another good example are various scientific NGOs who are called upon in global bodies, IGOs, dealing with, say, climate change or other issues where science is important. They need to bring in these experts. These groups with the power of information actually can go beyond just providing information. They can have direct impacts, and that's the third way NGOs can influence world affairs. So for example, Amnesty International or a similar organization, Human Rights Watch, they can shame countries that are engaged in human rights violations. They can publicize these type of acts, these type of violations of citizen rights or human rights. And there are really interesting studies to show that this has an influence on these countries, because when you're publicly shamed that way, globally, by such an authoritative body, an authoritative NGO, this influences your interaction with other actors on the world stage. There are great studies that show that foreign direct investment, multinational corporations investing in your country, that declines when your country is publicly shamed for being a human rights violator. Sometimes countries act, or IGOs act, like the UN. There's good evidence to show that once an authoritative NGO like the Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International takes action, that it leads to policy change because these other actors are made aware and they also adapt their policies. So the final way, this direct impacts, we're talking about Amnesty International and public shaming, but there are all sorts of other examples of direct impacts. And we just gave a handful of them. So multinational corporations influencing directly policy, labor policies within countries, terror organizations having a dramatic impact. Next time, we're going to look at IGOs and their influence on world affairs. Today, we just focused on NGOs, which have been rising dramatically. And the argument is through these three influences, through changing attitudes of the participants, through sharing of information and becoming authoritative bodies, repositories of information, and then with direct policy impacts, this tremendous growth of NGOs is very important in world affairs. So next time, we'll look a little bit more closely at IGOs, these bridges between governments. We'll talk about their influence on world affairs.